Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com. And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 475, The Case of J. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the podcast where we get into the minutiae in all the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, have you ever enjoyed a case of J before?
I have, and the difficulty is finding a place to keep all 12 bottles of it.
I know.
But I've got a J stand where I usually keep my J pen. And instead, I can put those bottles very conveniently there. So there you are.
I am glad that somebody on this show is prepared.
Who?
Well, maybe not for the show, but at least for the case of J.
The case of J.
In this case, we have another Morley Montgomery Award-winning article from the Baker Street Journal. This one is from 2003 and was written by D.K. Andrews, M.D. And the longer title, if you really must know, is The Case of J, a psychoanalytic case study with particular attention to marriage neurosis. Who wrote that? Why is it significant? And why did it win the Morley Montgomery Award for 2003? Well, stay tuned. That's on this episode. Just a reminder that if you would find it in the kindness of your heart to support our show, it doesn't cost that much. You could do it for not only as little as $1 a month, but less than $1 a month. We have a plan where if you subscribe on an annual plan, you get a 10% discount. Check it out on patreon.com/trifles, or for a little more, you can join us over on Substack at trifles.substack.com. You pick the community that works for you and the plan that works for you monthly or annually, and you can be part of this. And what it means is not only do you support the show in terms of giving us the ability to do our research and to pay for everything that we need to pay for with regard to the ins and outs of hosting a podcast, but you also get to listen to the show ad-free, and you get bonus content. Yes, that's right. If anything, you get part of our monthly offering, Trifling Trifles, where we give you shorter versions of the show. You see how that works? You pay more, you hear us less. I think that's what an incentive to listen to us less. So check that out on our Trifling Trifles offerings, both on Patreon and on Substack. The latest one that we have just went up, so check it out. Okay, we are deep into the case of J. I remember when this first came out in the BSJ because it came out by someone that I had never heard of before. D.K. Andrews.
Yes, the great actor
is that?
Dana Andrews. Yeah. I had no idea he was a Sherlockian.
No.
Well, it turns out that D.K. Andrews is a pseudonym.
Well, wait a minute. We get D.K. Andrews' qualifications at the end of the article.
Oh, we do, don't we?
Yeah, after the notes. Actually, not in the PDF version. You have to go to a Remarkable Mixture. My copy of Remarkable Mixture. It says D.K. Andrews.
Well, I think they did repeat that in the BSJ.
Oh, did they? Okay.
It is in the PDF. Yeah.
D.K. Andrews, M.D. University of Vienna, 1900 to 1905. Studied psychoanalysis under Sigmund Freud. After his medical training, he established a private practice in London, and he published several case studies in psychoanalysis. And it says that this is reprinted from the Archives of Psychoanalysis, Volume 12, Number 4, 1927. But who was D.K. Andrews, really?
Well, actually, and that's one of the lovely things about this particular essay, this created persona, and this essay that matches the style and spirit and language and feeling of a psychiatric treatise of the 1920s or 30s. But in reality, D.K. Andrews was Donald K. Pollock, and Andrew L. Soberg. And Don is a great Sherlockian. He's a professor of anthropology and psychiatry at SUNY Buffalo. He was at the State University of New York. Member of the Six Napoleons, member of many other things. Founder and editor of Baker Street Miscellany. He edited the Baker Street Journal from 1996 to 1999. So he's a great Sherlockian. And Andy Solberg, is a
retired strategic planner, yeah.
Yeah, retired strategic planner, public health expert, and a consultant, and a student of philosophy, among other things, and a great Sherlockian.
They both are, absolutely. And this is a collaboration between them that won the Morley Montgomery Award for 2003. Now, as we go through this, there is going to be a section that we will ask you to pay particular attention to because there is a listener participation portion. So get a piece of paper and a pencil or whatever writing implement you like handy and be at the ready. We will tell you when well, actually, we're not going to tell you. You just need to pay attention to the whole episode. There are 13 stories that are referred to in this article. A baker's dozen or a Baker Street dozen of stories. If you are paying attention and you write them down and you get them correct, all in order, and you write into us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. That's trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Put Baker Street dozen in the subject line and let us know what the list of stories is. Well, we will have a little something for you. So, where do we begin with this psychoanalysis?
Well, we begin with the premise, which is, as I say, to recreate the feeling and spirit of a 1920, 1930 psychology journal, something like the Lancet or so on, that Freud might have published a report on in terms of his researches. And that's why we have the case of J. J is the name of the subject, and the identity of J is masked. And so Dr. Andrews here begins by saying, I met a 75-year-old physician at my club to whom I shall refer as J. We were both medical men, naturally drawn to each other. He spoke freely about his life. I was more reticent about my own life, but I listened to his stories with considerable interest, for his life has been interesting. He was trained as a surgeon, but is also well known as an author. And he has had occasion to room with a consulting detective and has penned a well-read series of chronicles of the cases of his friend. I've never read these reports, regarding them as somewhat vulgar. They were a popular form of entertainment. But after meeting Jay, I read them with considerable interest, and I found them to be intriguing, well-crafted accounts offering as much insight into their author as perspective on the ostensible detective subject. And that there is the entire premise. This is, what you might attempt to write if you were a psychoanalyst and you found Jay, whom you will now probably have identified as John Watson, on your couch.
What? This is John Watson? You're kidding me.
Could be. Or James.
yeah, exactly. And so it goes on, and we're not going to read the entire thing verbatim, but we will give you a sense of it. This is the conversations didn't bring up any new material. Everything that's available is already in the public. And he went on to describe Jay as affable but correct, middle class. Met a lot of famous people, ruling politicians, royalty, etc. He had been a surgeon. He didn't have a lot to say about his family. He had a brother who died in 1888, which he viewed as tragic. His brother was addicted to alcohol, which affected his fortunes, ruined his liver, ultimately resulting in his death, and he didn't have any other siblings. Didn't mention his parents. I thought he was brought up in Scotland. He's been married at least twice, and he's never mentioned any children from either marriage. The first marriage he mentioned was in 1888, proposing after meeting a woman 3 days prior. That marriage lasted nearly 6 years when his wife died under undisclosed circumstances in early 1894. And then his next marriage was in 1902, and that wife is still living. And he was complimentary to his friend, the detective, and they had an off and on living association, strong friendship there, and they went for long periods without seeing his friend, and then they lost contact. And then he periodically writes chronicles of these adventures. The last was recorded in 1914. The author says these accounts are remarkable reading. We would agree, not only for their romantic view of his friend's activities, but also for what they reveal about Jay himself. Much can be inferred about Jay's personality.
Yeah, and that sets you up here for what we're about to get into, which is the probing of Jay and exactly what's going on in his mind. But I would point out that earlier up in the episode, there was a very nice little reference here where Dr. Andrews points out to the reader that, Dr. Freud himself worked insightfully with similar limitations in his studies of Moses, Leonardo da Vinci, and other historical figures who were unavailable to his penetrating direct analysis. So now we've got sort of the Freud precedent here of doing this sort of exploration. But our author goes on to say that what's going on here in his views about domestic life. There seems to be a marked conflict about marriage that led me to comb Jay's writings for more clues to his own experiences. And so let me begin by reviewing more systematically the evidence offered by Jay's public accounts of his detective friend. It's not surprising that marriages and marriage relations are found in many of the nearly 60 cases that Jay has published. Now, again, this is supposedly written in the 1920s. What's remarkable, however, is the fact that of the 27 cases in which marriage plays a major role, those marriages are portrayed negatively in 24 as tragic, fraught with deception, racked by infidelity, or ended in the harm or even murder of one spouse by another. Indeed, as I will suggest later, it appears that Jay has chosen to include some of the cases that comprise the chronicles of his detective friend only because they convey this implicitly tragic view of marriage and lack any other obvious contribution to the biography of his detective friend. And now we get into examples.
Yeah, the first account, he says, is one where a young woman was forced to marry a man she didn't love, despite the fact that she was in love with another. The young woman died within a month of her marriage, and the man she loved avenged her death by murdering her husband. Now, that tragic marriage might have been regarded as an incidental issue were it not for the pattern that it initiates. Indeed, a similar theme appears in other cases Jay's recorded. For example, in another published case, a young woman was forced to marry someone despite the fact that she was in love with another. As soldiers in India, the man she married had betrayed the man she loved, allowing him to be captured by the enemy in order to remove him as a rival for the woman's affections. When the poor man she loved made his way back to England after 30 years, her husband became apoplectic and died.
And in another published story, a man beat his wife and was murdered in turn by an old admirer of the woman. In yet another story, in a small variation on the theme, a woman was forced into a fraudulent marriage. It takes little imagination to see that this repeated pattern holds some fascination for Jay. In another tale, the wife of a man of diplomatic rank gave a highly confidential and inflammatory letter to a spy. This represents an almost incomprehensible level of spousal disloyalty, particularly in the wife of a career government official and diplomat.
In yet another story, a man deceived his wife about his profession, hiding from her the fact that he disguised himself as a common beggar to make money. Indeed, at the outset of the story, Jay found his detective friend in an opium den, which Jay had volunteered to visit in hopes of convincing another friend to return to his wife. In a different story, a man was deceived by his wife who did not reveal to him that she had a child from a previous marriage. In this tale, the detective played virtually no role, and one must question why Jay published the case, other than to portray a bad marriage. This is reminiscent of another one of his takes, in which a wife demanded that her husband never ask her about her past. Spousal trust is not common in Jay's accounts.
And in a story which has enjoyed some popularity among the hoi polloi, a man required that his wife pretend to be his sister, and he subjected her to physical abuse. In a different story, a man murdered and cut off the ears of his wife and her lover. In yet another, a man similarly killed his wife and her lover. In still one more, a married woman who worked in a circus took a lover, a circus strongman, who eventually killed her husband. Wives appear to be less free to murder, however, and the lion they hoped would cover up their act turned on the woman instead, disfiguring her beyond recognition. This is another case in which Jay's detective friend was a passive participant, and one wonders why. With more exciting cases among his files, Jay chose to publish this one. In another story, a husband caused his wife to be imprisoned with her lover in Siberia.
Well, he says one could go on in this vein, cataloging a virtual encyclopedia of marital disaster in Jay's accounts of his detective friend, but we find marriages that have failed, that have become murderous, and in which deceit, lies, suspicion, and tragedy prevail. Indeed, of the 3 cases in which marriages are portrayed as relatively stable and healthy, 3 cases, tragedy disrupts at least 2 In one case, a couple appears to enjoy a happy marriage, but the husband appears to have died in the end, reportedly lost overboard on the ship in which they had escaped. In another story, a happy marriage was destroyed by another man when he had the husband killed. There appears to be only one uninterrupted happy marriage in all of Jay's accounts. It may be significant that the only happy marriages that Jay describes are found among foreigners, North and South Americans or Italians, as fellow countrymen and women suffer marriage less happily. Suffer marriage. That's an interesting turn of phrase there.
Of all the patterns one can perceive in Jay's writings, the most obvious is his portrayal of marriage in an overtly hostile light. The puzzle presented here is that Jay appears to have no overt or obvious reason to regard marriage as a dangerous institution, a tragic relationship, or a setting saturated with lies, mistrust, and deceit. Yet he constantly portrays marriage in such ways in his writings. His own marriages appear in print to have been happy, and so we must look to his unconscious for reasons why he might have chosen so often to introduce unhappy marriages into his accounts, to portray the institution in such jaundiced terms. If we regard Jay's extensive writings as projective exercises in which he selected, shaped, and highlighted elements in ways that are revealing of his personality, we might examine those writings with sensitivity to what they might reveal. Therefore, let us for a moment consider the tales written by Jay to be similar to a series of projective exercises and consider what analytic insights we may gain from them.
So here we get into a discussion of Watson's first marriage, noting that he met his bride-to-be and proposed to her in 3 days. They say it's a most unlikely act for an English gentleman, but in this case, the surrounding circumstances may have prompted him to act with haste that might be regarded as reckless. So this took place in 1888. Several events coincided around this time, judging from Jay's published writings and from our private conversations, and they've become blended or merged in Jay's mind. First, Jay went out of his way to recount in print an incident in which the detective friend drew several conclusions from Jay's pocket watch. It belonged to Jay's father. Jay's older brother inherited it, and he had a bad end, falling into poverty and drinking himself to death. And then it was pawned. And then after his brother's death, the watch passed to Jay. And this is something that demonstrated his friend's detective skill. Now, this is noticeable because it leads Jay to reveal publicly information about his family that he clearly regarded as private and sensitive in nature. And he mentioned he recently came into possession of it, and that his relationship with his brother had been ambivalent. The younger brother, who's jealous of his older brother, no doubt the favorite of the parents, got the watch from the father, but the brother's failures made the parental favor all the more bitter for Jay. The favored son was unable to live up to his parents' expectations and hopes, while Jay, perhaps sublimating his jealousy, became a respected professional man and successful author. And so here we have Jay in 1888, troubled by the death of his older brother. Emotionally, he's in grief, but also resentful of his brother for being the favored child, and guilty over his own jealousy of his brother, and couldn't resolve that guilt with his brother being dead. It's not surprising that Jay experienced this jumble of conflicting emotions that led him to invite his detective friend's deductions, and then, of course, responded with anger and outrage when those deductions proved all too accurate. And nor is it surprising then that Jay, feeling conflicting emotions and feeling the loss of his one and only sibling, might supplant that loss by proposing marriage to a woman, even though he hardly knew her.
But Jay's neurosis is almost certainly deeper than this sibling rivalry. The ambivalence he experiences is certainly familiar to my psychoanalytic colleagues, who so often see it as an overt symptom of repressed hostility towards a parent, in neuroses characterized by a failure adequately to resolve the emotional upheavals of the Oedipal phase of psychological development, as pointed out by Dr. Freud in his essay Totem and Taboo. In Jay's case, one may reasonably speculate that his ambivalence towards his brother represents the displaced hostility felt towards his father, an unresolved Oedipal hostility that led Jay unconsciously to regard no man as an adequate husband and no mother as a loyal wife. Such a psychodynamic conflict would certainly account for Jay's hostility towards the institution of marriage. Like his detective friend, it remains for us to examine other evidence before we reach a conclusion.
Good old Oedipus, rearing his head. You may have heard about Oedipus Rex.
Oedipus Rex.
Freud included him in his odd complex. But
he loved his mother.
Yes. The relations that we get here, the king of a nation, that would be Oedipus, is an obvious father figure, and he's got relations to his wives, both former lover and wife-to-be, that are clearly troubled. So this relationship between father figure of the king and the symbolic son, in this case the detective, a surrogate for Jay himself, is crucial. It's a classically troubled Oedipal scene in which the son is at once loving toward the father, but also disdainful of him and a rival. And the son, again, the displaced Jay, penetrates the inner sanctum of the symbolic mother, the king's former lover, through the use of an all-too phallic rocket, which he collapses in exhaustion on her couch. The entire time he's disguised as a priest. Oh, excuse me. You know what? I jumbled that.
Yeah, you want to take that again?
Yeah.
Because I think we missed the fact that it's the first story here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we were explicit about the last paragraph on the bottom of 30,
actually,
for example, in the very first
I was
of
actually
Jay's
going to leave
short
out the
stories.
whole Scandal in Bohemia portion. I didn't mean to get sucked into that.
Fine. Well, let's get rid of it. Yeah.
So, in another story, and I think you'll pretty much understand which one this is as well, a man falsely accuses his wife of being a vampire who sucks the blood out of her infant when, in fact, she is protecting him from the attempted poisoning at the hands of the older brother. And it seems that by including this story, Jay could express his Oedipal feelings at having his mother falsely accused by an unfair father and his latent hostility towards his older brother. The theme is especially prominent inasmuch as the image of the vampire combines both the murderous impulse and the eroticism of the Oedipal instinct. And the unfair father theme, again, it's common in his writings, Dr. Andrews writes. In one story, a father kills one of his daughters and attempts to kill the other, doing so by sending the snake down a false bell rope. In another one, the father pretends to be the suitor of his daughter. In another, a father falsely accuses his son of stealing. In another, a father imprisons his daughter. In a different story, a father commits murder and the son is accused. The father admits to the crime only after the detective discovers the real culprit. So it may be that in Jay's family history, Jay's father was unfair both to his mother and to him, and that Jay's defense mechanism for dealing with his pain is to reflect such behavior in his writings and the behavioral manifestation of the characteristic hallucinatory representations of potentially gratifying objects. Say that 3 times fast.
Yeah. Well, now at this point in the paper, we've got some really well-written analysis that continues to explore these sorts of defense mechanisms and issues surrounding the relationship between Jay and his detective friend. Another defense mechanism allows Jay to deal with his sordid paternal experience. It's Jay's near idolization of his friend the detective. And Holmes, it seems that Jay is utilizing primitive idealization in idealizing his friend, in this case, a substitute for his father, not only in his own mind, but for his readers. And the speculation about the father's effect on Jay is buttressed by the fact that both Jay and his brother possess addictive personalities. And then we're pointed to previously noted phallic references which abound in the stories. In 2 of the stories, people have appendages cut off by assailants. In one of these stories mentioned earlier, a husband who's been emasculated by his wife's affair with another man tracked them down and cut off their ears. In another, a man has his thumb excised. In another story, a father murders one of his 2 daughters and attempts to murder the others. It's notable because the father violates his daughter's bedroom by inserting a poisonous snake, a clear phallic reference, through a hole in the wall. Well, these cases all imply that Jay's neuroses are partly located in his failure to negotiate successfully the phallic stage of his early development, at approximately 4 or 5 years old.
Poor little
Certainly,
Watson.
Marriage between Jay's... Poor Jay. Certainly the marriage between Jay's father and mother could not have been a happy one. And this provides the context for Jay's profiles of marriage within his writings.
And they go on, talking about Jay's mother may have been disloyal to his father, some treachery involved. But the only way Jay can reconcile his deep-seated fear with his need to behave in an acceptable manner, his oblique choice of marriages portrayed in his writings for all the world to read, is an acceptable way of articulating this deep-seated fear. And given the breadth of his writings on marriage, one can only wonder how destructive his father was. And Jay, it also seems, in a comic sense, uses repression as another defense mechanism. He consistently states at one point that his war wound was in his leg, and at another point he states that it was in his shoulder. My colleagues will recognize that this is common among soldiers and is often referred to in the psychoanalytic literature as war neuroses. Jay has repressed the exact location of his wound in order to deal with the overall effects that his military experience had on him over the years. And it's easy to see why his unconscious has forced him to do this. As a physician who's forced out of the war because he was a patient, Jay suffered from the reversal of roles that's antithetical to his ego.
In sum, we are presented with the extraordinary, the remarkably jaundiced portrait of marriage that extends over several decades of published stories. And upon subjecting the author to basic psychoanalytic consideration, we find the exceptional reveals itself as all too ordinary. Jay's marriage neurosis may be unique in literature. I am unaware of any other sustained commentary on the institution that depicts it so negatively over such a long period. But the underlying mechanisms that converted his childhood experiences into adult behavior are well known and their effects are commonplace. My therapeutic judgment was that Jay's age and social circumstances made him an unlikely candidate for depth analysis. But his writings have perhaps served in place of therapy for nearly 50 years. However unhappy his literary marriages may have been, Jay remains a contented individual.
And I think that's because the original prescription was to take 2 brandies and call me in the morning. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Dr. John Watson, formerly medical officer attached to the Royal Berkshires, now in civilian practice.